Snow fell in silent veils over the kingdom of Ashworth, blanketing the ancient oaks and stone walls with a purity that belied the cruelty festering within. The castle rose against the pewter sky like a monument to power inherited rather than earned, its towers piercing the low clouds, its windows glowing faintly with the warmth of privilege. Beyond its iron gates, the village huddled in the valley below, a cluster of thatched roofs and smoking chimneys where common folk lived their quiet, invisible lives. In a modest cottage at the edge of the village, where the forest began its slow encroachment, and the sound of the river could be heard even through shuttered windows, Adese knelt before her hearth, feeding the flames with the last of her kindling. The fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows across the walls, hung with fabric samples and half-finished garments, evidence of a craft that had become her salvation and her solitary companion. She was 26 years old, tall and slender, with skin the color of burnished bronze and eyes that held the depth of ancient forests. Her hair, thick and coiled, was wrapped in a simple linen cloth, and her fingers, long, graceful, marked by countless needle pricks, moved now to warm themselves against the modest heat. Her mother had arrived in this land as a child, brought by Venetian traders who dealt in spices, silk, and human cargo with equal indifference. She had been purchased by a wandering merchant who, in an unexpected act of conscience, had freed her upon his deathbed and left her a small sum that she had used to travel north, seeking anonymity in a kingdom where her face would be strange, but her skills might find value. She had taught Adese to sew before she could read, had pressed needles into her small hands and whispered, "This is freedom, child. What you create with your own hands, no one can take from you." Her mother had been dead for 7 years now, taken by a fever that swept through the village with merciless efficiency. But her words remained, stitched into every garment Adese produced, woven into the very fabric of her survival. A knock at the door shattered the morning stillness. Adese rose slowly, her heart quickening with the instinctive wariness of one accustomed to unwelcome visitors. She smoothed her worn wool dress, a deep burgundy that she had dyed herself using berries from the forest, and crossed the small room to lift the latch. The man standing before her wore the livery of Castle Ashworth, crimson and gold, the colors of the Duchess. He was perhaps 40, with a face weathered by service and eyes that avoided hers with practiced discomfort. "You are the seamstress," he said. It was not a question. "I am." He extended a sealed letter, the wax bearing the imprint of a crowned serpent, the sigil of House Ashworth. "You are summoned to the castle tomorrow at the hour of 2. The Duchess requests your presence for afternoon tea." Adese did not reach for the letter immediately. She studied the messenger's face, searching for some explanation, some hint of the trap she sensed closing around her. "The Duchess wishes to take tea with me? Those are my instructions. For what purpose?" The messenger's jaw tightened. "I do not question the Duchess. Neither should you." He thrust the letter forward again, and this time Adese accepted it, the parchment cold and heavy in her hands. "Be prompt. Her Grace does not tolerate tardiness." He turned and departed without farewell, his boots crunching through the snow until the sound faded into the muffled silence of winter. Adese closed the door and leaned against it, the letter pressed to her chest. Her breath came shallow now, her mind racing through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. She had never spoken to the Duchess, had never even stood in her presence. She knew Lady Helena Ashworth only by reputation, a woman of 30 winters, beautiful in the cold manner of marble statues, widowed young when her husband fell in battle against the Scots, now ruling the estate with an iron will and a tongue sharp enough to draw blood. The village spoke of her in whispers, of servants dismissed for imagined slights, of merchants ruined for prices she deemed impertinent, of a cruelty so refined it appeared almost like grace. She was feared, resented, and obeyed, the unholy trinity of aristocratic authority. And now she had summoned Adese to tea. The seal broke with a soft crack, and Adese unfolded the parchment. The handwriting was elegant, the ink dark and precise. "To the seamstress known as Adese, you are hereby invited to attend afternoon tea at Castle Ashworth on the morrow, at the 2nd hour past midday." Your presence is requested in the Rose Gallery. Appropriate attire is expected. Do not disappoint. Lady Helena Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth. Adaz read the words 3 times, searching for hidden meaning, for some clue to the Duchess's intentions. Appropriate attire is expected. The phrase carried the weight of mockery, a reminder that whatever Adaz wore would be judged inadequate, foreign, inferior. She knew, with the certainty of long experience, that this invitation was not an honor. It was a performance, a theater of humiliation in which she had been cast as the unwitting fool. The Duchess had heard of her, of the dark-skinned seamstress whose work had begun to attract attention from minor nobles seeking quality without the London prices, and had decided to make an example. Adaz walked to her workbench and sat heavily upon the stool, the letter still clutched in her fingers. Through the small window, she could see the snow continuing to fall, each flake a tiny surrender to gravity and dissolution. She could refuse. She could claim illness, or simply not appear. But she understood with the clarity of one who had navigated hostility all her life that refusal would only postpone the reckoning. The Duchess would find another way to reach her, would perhaps send soldiers instead of messengers, would perhaps destroy her reputation with a few well-placed words among the noble houses whose patronage Adaz had so carefully cultivated. No, she would go. She would walk into whatever trap had been laid, and she would face it with the dignity her mother had bequeathed her. But she would not go as a supplicant. She would not dress in borrowed finery or attempt to imitate the fashions she had studied in order to create them for others. She would go as herself, as the woman she had made herself become through years of labor and loneliness and unyielding determination. Adaz rose and crossed to the corner of her cottage, where a wooden chest sat beneath a hanging tapestry she had woven during her first winter alone. She lifted the lid and withdrew a length of fabric unlike anything in the castle's possession. Kente cloth, brought from the Gold Coast by the same traders who had brought her mother, preserved through decades as a family treasure more precious than gold. The cloth blazed with color, deep reds and brilliant yellows, intricate geometric patterns that told stories her mother had only half remembered, traditions from a homeland neither of them would ever see. It had been her mother's wedding cloth, worn once and then hidden away, a secret too valuable to display in a land that would not understand its meaning. Adaz had never worn it, had never dared. But now, facing an invitation designed to diminish her, she understood that this was precisely the moment for which it had been saved. She would create a gown. Not an English gown, not a French gown, but something entirely her own. A fusion of the skills she had mastered and the heritage she had inherited. She had one day to design and construct and finish a garment that would speak louder than any words she could offer. The needle found her hand as if by instinct, and Adaz began to sew. If you too cherish stories of courage and dignity set against the backdrop of a world that sought to diminish them, check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every story here is crafted for hearts that believe in quiet strength and the grace of those who refuse to be broken. Subscribe now and let us continue this journey together. Through the night she worked, her fingers moving by candlelight long after the village had surrendered to sleep. The fire burned low and was revived. The candles guttered and were replaced. She did not pause for food, barely stopped for water, driven by a focus so complete it bordered on meditation. By dawn, the gown was nearly complete. It was magnificent, a creation that defied categorization, that belonged to no single tradition, and therefore transcended them all. The bodice was structured in the European manner, but adorned with the kente cloth in bold, deliberate panels that drew the eye like flames. The sleeves were fitted to the elbow, and then flared in the African style her mother had described from fragments of memory. The skirt fell in generous folds, the fabric shimmering with each movement, and at the hem, Adaz had embroidered a border of golden thread in patterns that echoed both English roses and the sacred symbols of a continent she had never seen. She held it up to the morning light filtering through her window and felt for the first time in years something like hope. Not hope that the Duchess would receive her kindly, she harbored no such illusion, but hope that she would enter that castle as something more than a victim, Hope that she would show them what dignity looked like when it could not be purchased, when it had to be forged in the fire of exclusion and hammered into shape by hands that refused to tremble. She dressed carefully, braided her hair in an elaborate style her mother had taught her, and wrapped her head in a matching cloth that crowned her like the royalty her ancestors had been before traders and chains had rewritten their destinies. When she looked in the small mirror that hung beside her bed, a mirror she had saved for months to purchase, she saw a stranger. Or rather, she saw the woman she might have been in a different world, in a different time. She saw her mother's strength and her grandmother's grace and something entirely her own. A beauty that had nothing to do with conformity, and everything to do with truth. The walk to Castle Ashworth took nearly an hour, up winding paths slick with ice, past fields lying fallow beneath the snow, through the village square where faces turned to stare at her passing. She heard the whispers, saw the pointing fingers, felt the weight of curiosity and confusion and, from some, unmistakable hostility. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She was done shrinking. The castle gates loomed before her, iron and stone, guarded by men in crimson cloaks who regarded her approach with open astonishment. One of them, the senior guard, judging by the silver clasp at his throat, stepped forward to block her path. "State your business." Adaze withdrew the letter from the fold of her cloak and extended it silently. The guard examined the seal, read the contents, and his eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. He looked from the letter to her face, to her extraordinary garment, and back again, as if attempting to solve a puzzle whose pieces did not fit. "You are expected," he said finally, his voice betraying nothing. "Follow the path to the main entrance. A servant will escort you from there." She inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement, not gratitude, and passed through the gates into the vast courtyard beyond. Castle Ashworth was even more imposing from within. Towering walls of gray stone, windows like watching eyes, gardens now dormant beneath the winter's grasp, but hinting at the grandeur of warmer seasons. Servants hurried across the courtyard on various errands, and each one paused to observe her passage, their faces reflecting the same bewilderment she had seen at the gate. At the main entrance, a woman in the modest dress of an upper servant stood waiting. Her expression was carefully neutral, though her eyes widened fractionally at the sight of Adaze's gown. "The Duchess is expecting you," she said. "Follow me." They walked through corridors lined with tapestries and portraits, past suits of armor standing sentinel in alcoves, up a sweeping staircase, and down another hallway until they reached a door carved with roses and guarded by two more liveried men. The servant paused. "The Rose Gallery," she announced, and opened the door. Adaze stepped through. The Rose Gallery lived up to its name in exhaustive detail. Roses adorned every surface, carved into the ceiling beams, woven into the carpets, painted on the walls in faded murals that depicted gardens more imagined than remembered. Tall windows lined one wall, flooding the space with pale winter light, and at the far end, before a fireplace large enough to roast an ox, a long table had been set for tea. Around it sat 7 women. They turned as one at Adaze's entrance, and she felt the collective weight of their assessment like a physical force. Eyes traveling from her face to her gown to her head wrap and back, cataloging every detail, searching for weakness. At the head of the table sat the Duchess herself. Lady Helena Ashworth was beautiful in the manner of winter, pale and precise and utterly without warmth. Her hair was the color of corn silk, elaborately styled beneath a headdress of pearls and silver. Her gown was deep blue velvet, trimmed with ermine, and her hands, folded gracefully upon the table, bore rings that could have fed the village for a year. She did not rise. She did not smile. She simply regarded Adaze with eyes the color of a frozen lake, and said, in a voice like silk drawn across glass, "So, the famous seamstress has arrived." The other women tittered, a sound like birds startled from a branch. Adaze noted them in quick succession. Lady Margaret, the Duchess's younger sister, with the same cold beauty and an expression of eager malice. Lady Catherine, wife of the Earl of Pemberton, whose elaborate gown suggested she valued quantity over taste, and 4 others whose names Adaze did not know, but whose attitudes were immediately apparent. They were here as audience, as witnesses to whatever humiliation was planned. Your Grace. Adaze curtsied with perfect form, a curtsy she had practiced in her cottage until her knees ached, determined to give no ammunition on grounds of protocol. I am honored by your invitation. Are you? The Duchess's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. How delightful. Please take a seat. We have been most curious to meet the woman who has been stealing our custom. Adaze walked to the empty chair that had been positioned, she noticed, at the far end of the table, as distant from the Duchess as possible while still technically being a guest. She sat with her spine straight and her hands folded, mirroring the Duchess's own posture. I was not aware that I had stolen anything, Your Grace, she said calmly. I merely offer my services to those who seek them. Lady Margaret laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. Listen to her. She speaks as if she were one of us. Remarkable, isn't it? The Duchess agreed. One might almost forget. She let the sentence trail off, the unspoken words hanging in the air like poison. A servant appeared at Adaze's elbow, pouring tea into a delicate porcelain cup. Adaze accepted it with a murmured thanks, noting how her fingers, dark against the white china, seemed to fascinate and repulse her companions in equal measure. I must confess, Lady Catherine said, leaning forward with theatrical interest. I have never seen anything quite like your costume. Is that what they wear in Africa? The question was delivered with exaggerated innocence, as if she were inquiring about the weather. But the tone beneath it was unmistakable, ridicule dressed in courtesy. This cloth comes from the Gold Coast, Adaze replied, her voice steady. It is called kente, and it has been worn by royalty for generations. Each pattern carries meaning. Each color tells a story. How quaint! The Duchess lifted her cup and took a delicate sip. I suppose every culture has its little traditions, however charming they might seem to those who know no better. Another flutter of laughter from the assembled ladies. Adaze felt it wash over her like water over stone, present but unable to penetrate. I designed this gown myself, she continued, as if the interruption had not occurred. The construction follows European techniques, but the materials and some elements of the design honor my mother's heritage. I believe that beauty can be found in many traditions, and that a true artist knows how to blend them. The Duchess's eyes narrowed slightly. This was not the reaction she had expected. The seamstress was supposed to be intimidated, humiliated, reduced to stammering gratitude for the mere privilege of sitting in their presence. Instead, she spoke of art and heritage as if she were their equal. A bold claim, Lady Helena said slowly, though I wonder if your blending meets the standards of those with more refined tastes. She gestured to Lady Margaret. My sister, for instance, has recently commissioned a gown from Madame Leclerc in London. The finest dressmaker in England, they say. Perhaps you have heard of her? I have. Adaze set down her teacup with careful precision. I trained with Madame Leclerc for 2 years before she dismissed me. This admission produced a moment of genuine surprise. The Duchess's composure flickered briefly before reasserting itself. Dismissed? How unfortunate. Might I ask why? Because her clients grew uncomfortable with my presence in her shop. They preferred not to be attended by someone who looked as I do. Madame Leclerc valued their custom over my skills. The honesty was deliberate, a refusal to hide behind comfortable lies. The Duchess had expected her to be defensive, ashamed, eager to obscure any blemish in her history. By presenting her dismissal as simple fact, without apology or self-pity, Adaze denied her the satisfaction. And yet, Lady Catherine said with faux sympathy, you have managed to establish yourself here in our little village. How very enterprising. Survival often requires enterprise, Adaze agreed. As does excellence. I have found that when my work speaks, its voice is louder than the color of my hands. A moment of silence descended upon the gallery, the kind of silence that precedes either violence or revelation. The Duchess set down her own cup and regarded Adaze with an expression that had shifted from contempt to something more complex. Curiosity mingled with irritation, perhaps even a trace of unwilling respect. "You are very confident," Lady Helena observed, "for a woman in your position." "My position, Your Grace, is that of a craftswoman who has been invited to tea by the most powerful woman in the region. I do not know why I am here, but I suspect it is not to discuss fashion. If you wish to insult me, you may do so directly. If you wish to threaten me, I am listening. But I will not pretend not to see what is plainly before me, and I will not diminish myself to make this moment easier for either of us." The other women gasped. Lady Margaret's hand flew to her chest as if she had been struck. Even the servants, standing motionless along the walls, seemed to hold their breath. The Duchess rose from her chair. She was taller than Adayz had expected, and more imposing. She moved around the table with slow, deliberate steps, her gown whispering against the carpet, her eyes never leaving Adayz's face. She stopped directly before the seamstress, close enough that Adayz could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive, roses and something darker beneath. "You are either very brave," Lady Helena said quietly, "or very foolish. Perhaps I am simply tired, Your Grace. Tired of pretending not to notice when I am being mocked. Tired of smiling through slights. I came here today prepared to endure whatever performance you had arranged. But I find that I lack the energy for games. If you mean to destroy me, please proceed. If you have some other purpose, I am willing to hear it." For a long moment, the Duchess did not move. Her face was unreadable, a mask of porcelain perfection that revealed nothing of the calculations occurring behind it. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a suggestion at the corners of her mouth. But it was genuine, the first genuine expression Adayz had seen from her since entering the room. "You are not what I expected," the Duchess said. "Few people are, Your Grace, when they are allowed to speak for themselves." Lady Helena turned away, walking to the window where the pale light framed her like a portrait. She stood there for a moment, gazing out at the snow-covered gardens, her back to the room. "Leave us," she said. The other women exchanged confused glances. Lady Margaret began to protest. "Helena, surely you cannot mean—" "I said leave." The Duchess's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "All of you, now." One by one, with varying degrees of reluctance and bewilderment, the ladies rose from their chairs and departed. Lady Margaret was the last to go, casting a venomous glance at Adayz before closing the door behind her. The gallery fell silent. The Duchess remained at the window, her figure dark against the brightness beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, softer now, stripped of its earlier cruelty. "I did intend to humiliate you," she admitted. "I had heard of your growing reputation, and I found it threatening. A woman of your origin, creating garments that rival the finest in the land. It offended something in me that I am not proud of." Adayz said nothing. She waited. "But watching you just now, watching you refuse to break, refuse to perform the role I had assigned you, I find myself—" Lady Helena paused, searching for the word. "Curious." She turned from the window and met Adayz's eyes. "Tell me about yourself. The truth. Not the version you tell customers to make them comfortable, but the real story. Who are you? How did you come to be here?" It was such an unexpected request that Adayz found herself momentarily speechless. No one of rank had ever asked her such a question. No one had ever seemed to care. "Why do you wish to know, Your Grace?" "Because I have spent the past 5 years surrounded by sycophants and cowards who tell me only what they believe I wish to hear. I had forgotten what it looked like. Someone standing before me without fear, speaking truth without calculation. And I find—" Another pause, another hesitation. "I find I am hungry for it." The fire crackled in the great hearth, casting warmth across the gallery as the afternoon light began to fade toward evening. Adayz remained in her chair, the Duchess now seated across from her, not at the head of the table but in the place recently vacated by one of the departed ladies, as if deliberately abandoning the hierarchy that had defined their earlier interaction. My grandmother was taken from her village when she was 12 years old, Adiz began, her voice low and steady. She was sold to Portuguese traders who brought her to a market in Lisbon. She changed hands 3 times before arriving in Venice, where she was purchased by a spice merchant named Giacomo Fiorelli. The Duchess listened in silence, her face attentive. Fiorelli was neither kind nor cruel, merely indifferent, as one might be to a piece of furniture that performed its function adequately. My grandmother worked in his household for 11 years, learning Italian, learning to sew, learning to make herself indispensable. When Fiorelli died, his widow, who had never approved of keeping human property, freed her and gave her a small sum to start a new life. And she came to England? Eventually. She traveled first to France, then to Flanders, following work where she could find it. She was trained by a seamstress in Bruges who recognized her talent and taught her the techniques of European dressmaking. She never forgot the crafts of her homeland, the weaving, the dyeing, the patterns passed down through generations, but she learned to survive in this world by mastering its skills. Adeze touched the kente cloth of her gown, the fabric smooth beneath her fingers. She met my grandfather in Bruges. He was a merchant, English, though he spent more time abroad than at home. He was not a good man in many ways, but he loved her, or something close to it. He brought her back to England when he retired from trade, and my mother was born in a small town near Canterbury. And your father? A shadow crossed Adese's face. A sailor who passed through the village and left again before I was born. My mother never spoke of him, and I learned not to ask. The Duchess absorbed this in silence. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, thick flakes drifting past the windows like feathers shaken from the sky. When my mother died, Adeze continued, I was 19. I had already been sewing for years, working in the homes of minor nobility who valued skill over appearance, or who simply did not care as long as the work was done. I took every commission I could find, saved every coin I could spare, and eventually I had enough to open my own shop. In this village? It was cheap and far from London, where my reputation, or rather, the rumors about me, had become an obstacle. I thought that here, where no one knew my history, I might build something of my own. And have you? Adeze considered the question. I have survived. I have created work that I am proud of. But building something permanent... She shook her head. That requires more than skill. It requires acceptance, or at least tolerance. And those have always been in short supply. The Duchess rose from her chair and walked again to the window, but this time her posture was different, less imperious, more contemplative. The light caught the silver in her headdress, the pearls gleaming like frozen tears. My husband died 3 years ago, she said quietly. We had been married for 5 years, and I cannot say that I loved him. We barely knew each other before the wedding, and we learned little more afterward. But he was familiar, predictable, a presence that filled the space around me without demanding anything more than I was willing to give. She turned to face Adeze. Since his death, I have ruled this estate alone. I have fought off creditors and distant cousins who believe themselves more entitled to what is mine. I have maintained our position through carefully cultivated relationships with those who hold power, and I have done so by becoming exactly what they expected: cold, calculating, untouchable. A mask, Adeze said. Yes. The Duchess's voice was barely above a whisper. A mask. And I have worn it so long that I sometimes forget there is anything beneath. She returned to her seat, lowering herself with a weariness that belied her regal bearing. When I heard of you, of a woman who had created something from nothing, who had earned respect through excellence rather than inheritance, I felt threatened. But I think now that what I truly felt was envious. The admission hung in the air between them, vulnerable and extraordinary. You have something I lack, Lady Helena continued. Something I do not know how to name. A certainty in yourself that does not depend on the approval of others. A dignity that cannot be taken because it was never given. I invited you here to diminish that quality, to prove to myself that it was an illusion. But sitting here with you now, watching you wear that gown as if it were armor fashioned from stars, I understand that I was wrong. Adaze felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of tension she had not known she was carrying. For so long she had expected attack that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "I do not know what you want from me, Your Grace," she said honestly. "I am a seamstress. I make beautiful things for those who can afford them. Beyond that, I have little to offer." "You underestimate yourself." The Duchess leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "I have been thinking, since you entered this room and refused to break, about what it might mean to have someone like you in my life. Someone who would tell me truth, someone who would not pretend." "A friend?" The word seemed to startle them both. The Duchess laughed, a soft, uncertain sound utterly unlike her earlier coldness. "I have not had a friend since I was a child," she admitted. "I do not know if I would recognize one if she appeared before me." "Then perhaps," Adaze said carefully, "we might begin more simply. You could commission a gown." If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to leave a comment below. Simply write, "Dignity cannot be taken from those who have forged it in fire." Let me know that you are here, that you understand what it means to stand tall when the world expects you to bow. The Duchess stared at her for a moment, then laughed again, louder this time with genuine warmth. "A gown, of course, the most natural thing in the world." "I would need to take your measurements," Adaze continued, warming to the idea. "And we would need to discuss fabrics, colors, designs. It would require several meetings." "Several meetings." The Duchess nodded slowly. "To ensure the gown is perfect." "Precisely. And during these meetings we might..." "Talk?" "Conversations often occur during fittings, Your Grace. They help pass the time." Lady Helena smiled, a real smile, warm and almost shy. "Then I believe I am in need of a new gown. Something different. Something that does not look like everything else I own." "I may have some ideas," Adaze said. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Adaze had experienced since her arrival in the village. Twice each week, a carriage bearing the Ashworth crest arrived at her cottage to escort her to the castle. She brought her tools, her fabrics, her sketchbook filled with designs that grew bolder with each visit. And she brought herself, her stories, her observations, her carefully guarded truths, which she shared with the Duchess during long hours in the Rose Gallery. Lady Helena proved to be a different woman in private than in public. Stripped of her audience, freed from the performance that power required, she revealed depths that surprised them both. She was sharp-witted and well-read, fluent in 3 languages, and conversant in the philosophies of Greece and Rome. She loved music but could not play, loved gardens but had never planted so much as a seed with her own hands. She was lonely in ways she had never allowed herself to acknowledge, surrounded by people yet utterly alone. "Tell me about the kente cloth," she said one afternoon as Adaze adjusted the silk lining of the gown in progress. "You said each pattern has meaning. What does yours mean?" Adaze paused, her needle suspended mid-stitch. "The pattern is called Adwanayasa. It means, 'My skill is great,' or 'I have seen much.' It is typically worn by those who wish to assert their competence and wisdom. A fitting choice. My mother chose it. She wore it on her wedding day, and she always said she would give it to me when I married." Adaze resumed stitching, her movements automatic. "She died before I had the chance." The Duchess was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you wish to marry?" It was the kind of question no one had ever asked her, or rather, no one whose opinion she valued. Men had proposed over the years. Merchants seeking a wife who could sow their fortunes into visible success. Widowers looking for a mother for their children. Even once a young nobleman who claimed to love her and vanished when his family even. Once, a young nobleman who claimed to love her and vanished when his family threatened to disown him. "I have learned not to wish for things that seem impossible," Adaze said carefully. "Marriage requires acceptance, not only from the one who proposes, but from the world that would witness the union. For someone like me, that acceptance has always been beyond reach. Lady Helena set down her embroidery, a half-hearted project she had undertaken to have something to do with her hands during their sessions. And if the world's acceptance were not required, if there were someone who saw you as you are, without the veil of prejudice, then I suppose I would consider it. Adiz looked up from her work, meeting the Duchess's eyes. But such a person would need to be extraordinary indeed. They would need courage enough to defy convention and certainty enough to weather the storms that defiance would bring. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that hovered at the edge of words, too fragile yet to be spoken aloud. The door to the gallery opened, and a servant entered with a message. The Duchess read it quickly, her expression shifting from curiosity to displeasure. "It seems we will have visitors tomorrow," she announced. "Lord Edmund Blackwood and his mother, the Dowager Countess, have invited themselves to inspect the estate. They believe I require guidance in its management." "Lord Blackwood?" "A distant cousin of my late husband. He has been circling like a vulture since Richard's death, convinced that a woman cannot possibly manage what generations of men have built." Lady Helena crumpled the message in her fist. "He will bring his mother to lend respectability to his interference, and together they will spend 3 days questioning my decisions and suggesting improvements that conveniently align with their own interests." A Daisy watched the transformation occur, the warmth draining from the Duchess's face, replaced by the cold mask she wore for the world. It was like watching a door close. "I should not be here when they arrive," a Daisy said quietly. "My presence would only complicate matters." "No," the word was sharp, immediate. Lady Helena looked at her with something fierce in her eyes. "No, I want you here. I want them to see the gown we have created. I want them to understand that I make my own choices, forge my own alliances, and answer to no one for the company I keep." "Your Grace." "Helena." The Duchess crossed the room and took Adaise's hands in her own. The first time she had touched her with such deliberate intimacy. "When we are alone, I am Helena, and I am asking you, as something more than a patron, to stay. To stand beside me when they come. To remind me, by your presence, that I am more than the role they expect me to play." Adaize looked down at their joined hands, pale fingers intertwined with brown, 2 worlds meeting in a clasp that defied everything both had been taught to believe. "I will stay," she said. Lord Edmund Blackwood arrived the following afternoon with all the ceremony of a conquering general. His carriage was larger than necessary, his retinue more numerous than practical, and his bearing suggested that he considered the castle already his own. He was perhaps 45, with the soft face of a man who had never labored and the sharp eyes of one who calculated every interaction for potential advantage. His mother, the Dowager Countess Blackwood, was worse. She descended from the carriage as if stepping into something unpleasant, her nose wrinkled, her lips pursed in perpetual disapproval. She was small and precise, dressed in black as if in mourning for the entire world's failures to meet her standards. They were received in the great hall, where Lady Helena waited in full regalia, not the gown Adaize had made, not yet, but armor of a different kind, velvet and jewels and an expression of such frozen courtesy that even the fire in the massive hearth seemed to retreat from her presence. Adaize watched from the shadows of an alcove as they had arranged. She would not be introduced, not yet. First, she would observe. First, she would understand what they faced. "Cousin Helena," Lord Edmund said, bowing with exaggerated formality, "how gracious of you to receive us on such short notice." "The notice was yours to give, Lord Edmund. I merely responded as courtesy demanded." The Dowager Countess sniffed. "The castle looks maintained. I had heard rumors of neglect." "Then you have been listening to unreliable sources, my lady. The estate has never been more prosperous." "Prosperous?" Lord Edmund's eyebrows rose. "That is not what the accounts suggest. I have taken the liberty of reviewing the ledgers from the past 3 years, and I find certain irregularities. You reviewed ledgers that were not shared with you." Lady Helena's voice could have frozen the wine in their cups. How industrious! Family must look after family, the Dowager said smoothly. Especially when a woman finds herself alone in such demanding circumstances. It is only natural that Edmund should concern himself with Richard's legacy. Richard's legacy is my responsibility as his widow. The law is quite clear on this point. The law. Lord Edmund smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. The law can be interpreted, especially when questions arise about a widow's fitness to manage such substantial holdings. The threat was clear, delivered with the polish of long practice. Adès felt her hands clench at her sides, nails digging into her palms. Lady Helena did not flinch. If you have concerns about my fitness, Lord Edmund, I suggest you bring them before the proper authorities. Until then, you are a guest in my home, and I expect you to conduct yourself accordingly. The dinner that evening was a masterwork of veiled hostility. Course after course was served while conversation circled like wolves around wounded prey. Lord Edmund praised the wine while questioning its cost. The Dowager complimented the tapestries while wondering aloud if they might be sold to cover debts. Every kindness was a knife, every courtesy a cut. Through it all, Lady Helena maintained her composure. But Adès, watching from her position at a small table in the corner, she had been introduced as a craftsperson completing a commission, deliberately vague, could see the toll it was taking. The Duchess's shoulders grew more rigid with each passing hour, her smile more brittle, her eyes more hollow. When the meal finally ended and the guests retired to their chambers, Adès found Helena in the Rose Gallery, standing before the fire with her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold something in, or keep something out. They mean to take everything, the Duchess whispered. They will find or fabricate whatever evidence they need. They will petition whatever courts will listen, and they will not stop until I am cast out of my own home. Adès approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. What can be done? I do not know. Helena's voice cracked, the first time Adès had heard it waver. I have fought so long and I am so tired. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps a woman alone cannot hold what men have built. No. Adès stepped closer, close enough to touch. No, they are not right. They are merely loud, and wealth has taught them that volume equals truth. But you have something they do not. What? You have survived. You have ruled this estate for 3 years, through harvests and hardships, through challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. You have earned what they believe they deserve simply for existing. Adès reached out and turned Helena to face her. And you are not alone. Not anymore. Tears glistened in the Duchess's eyes, tears she had forbidden herself to shed for years. Why do you care? I brought you here to humiliate you. I plan to make you a spectacle for my entertainment. Why would you stand with me now? Because I know what it is to be underestimated. I know what it is to have everything you have built dismissed because of what you are rather than what you have done. And I know... Adès hesitated, then pressed forward. I know that somewhere beneath the mask you wear, there is a woman worth fighting for. I have seen her these past weeks. I have come to... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. To what? Helena whispered. The fire crackled. The snow fell silent beyond the windows. And in that moment, suspended between confession and retreat, Adès made her choice. To care for her, she said, more than I intended, more than is wise. Helena's breath caught. Her hand rose, trembling, to touch Adès's face, fingertips tracing the line of her cheekbone, the curve of her jaw, as if memorizing something precious. I have never, the Duchess began, then stopped, started again. I have never felt seen, truly seen. Not by my parents, who valued me only as a bargaining chip. Not by my husband, who wanted a decoration for his home. Not by anyone, until you walked into my gallery wearing a gown made of defiance and refused to let me diminish you. Helena. I do not know what this is, the Duchess continued, her voice barely audible. I do not have words for it, and I do not know if words exist. But I know that when you are near, the weight I carry becomes lighter. I know that your voice is the first sound I wish to hear each morning and the last I want to hear at night. I know that you have become necessary to me in ways I cannot explain and do not wish to examine too closely, because examination might reveal how terrifying it is to need someone this much. Hades closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of Helena's hand against her skin, the impossible intimacy of this moment stolen from a world that would condemn them both. Then do not examine it, she said softly. Simply let it be what it is. And what is it? A daze opened her eyes and met Helena's gaze, those winter lake eyes now warm with something that might have been hope. It is two women who have found in each other what the world denied them. It is connection without pretense, acceptance without condition. Call it friendship if that word brings comfort. Call it something else if you dare. But whatever its name, it is real, and it is ours, and I will not let anyone, not Lord Edmund, not his mother, not all the nobility in England, take it from us. Helena leaned forward, resting her forehead against a daisy's, their breath mingling in the warmth between them. Then help me, she whispered. Help me fight them. Help me show them that I am more than they believe, that we are more than they can imagine. How? Helena pulled back, and a new light had entered her eyes, determination replacing despair, purpose rising from the ashes of fear. Tomorrow evening, there is to be a formal dinner. Lord Edmund has invited several local nobles, allies he hopes to cultivate against me. I intended to endure it as I have endured everything else, alone, silent, surviving. She took Adaise's hands in her own. But now I have a different idea. Tell me. The gown we have been making, it is nearly finished, is it not? It could be completed by tomorrow if I work through the night. Then complete it. Helena's grip tightened. And wear it. Not as my seamstress, not as a craftsperson completing a commission, but as my honored guest, my companion. Let them see what I value, whom I choose to stand beside. Let them understand that their narrow definitions of worth mean nothing in my house. Helena, the risk. I know the risk. I know what they will say, what they will think, how they will use it against me. The Duchess's voice was steady now, certain. But I am done living in fear of their judgment. I am done pretending to be what they expect. If I am to lose everything, let it be for truth rather than lies. Let it be for something that matters. A daisy studied her face. This woman who had begun as an enemy and become something far more complicated, far more precious. She saw the fear beneath the determination, the vulnerability beneath the courage. She saw someone who was risking everything on a gesture that might destroy her. And she saw herself, reflected in those hopeful eyes, being offered a chance to stand in the light after a lifetime in shadows. I will need more candles, she said finally, and perhaps some wine. It will be a long night. Helena laughed, that warm, genuine sound that Adaise had come to treasure. You shall have whatever you need, and I shall sit with you while you work, if you will allow it. I would welcome the company. They worked through the night in Helena's private chambers, the fire kept high, candles burning on every surface. A daisy stitched with the focus of one for whom failure was not an option, her needle flashing in the golden light, her fingers moving with speed and precision born of desperation and love. Helena sat nearby, not idle but attentive, handing tools when needed, holding fabric when required, and talking softly through the dark hours to keep them both awake. She spoke of her childhood, of the mother who had died when she was young, and the father who had remarried a woman who resented her existence. She spoke of her marriage, of the loneliness of sharing a bed with a stranger, and the strange relief of his death. She spoke of dreams she had abandoned and hopes she had buried, and all the small surrenders that had accumulated into a life half-lived. And Adaise listened, and shared in return, stories of her mother, of her grandmother, of the long lineage of women who had survived by refusing to disappear. She spoke of the sea voyage her grandmother had endured, of the freedom that had been seized rather than given, of the pride that had been passed down through generations like a sacred flame. As dawn began to lighten the sky beyond the windows, Adiz tied the final knot and cut the last thread. The gown was complete. It was not the gown they had originally planned. That design had been beautiful, but safe. A masterwork of European technique with subtle African influences. This was something else entirely. During the long hours of the night, as Helena's stories had woven together with her own, Adeyezi had made changes. Bold changes, instinctive changes, alterations that felt less like decisions and more like inevitabilities. The bodice was structured in the European manner but covered entirely in kente cloth, not the muted tones of subtle blending, but the full blazing glory of the pattern her mother had worn. The sleeves were fitted to the elbow and then exploded into wide bells of silk the color of sunsets, edged with gold embroidery that caught the light like flame. The skirt fell in dramatic folds, layer upon layer of fabric in complementary hues, and at the hem, Adiz had embroidered a border that told a story. Roses intertwined with African symbols, two traditions embracing rather than competing. It was not a gown that would allow its wearer to blend in. It was not a gown designed for safety or subtlety or the comfort of those who would judge it. It was a declaration. Helena stared at it, spread across the bed like a living thing, and her hand rose to cover her mouth. "I know it is different from what we discussed," Adeyezi began, suddenly uncertain. "If you prefer the original design, I can—" "It is perfect." Helena's voice was thick with emotion. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. It will shock them." "Good." The Duchess turned to face her, and her eyes were bright with tears and determination. "I want to shock them. I want them to look at me and see someone they do not recognize, someone they cannot categorize or dismiss. I want them to understand that the woman they thought they knew never truly existed." Adiz smiled, exhaustion and relief washing over her in equal measure. "Then we should both rest. Tonight will require all our strength." "Will you stay?" Helena asked quietly. "Here, I mean. I have another bed in the adjoining room, and I do not—" She faltered, vulnerable in a way that would have been unimaginable weeks ago. "I do not wish to be alone. I will stay." They slept through the morning and into the afternoon, rising only when Helena's maid came to begin preparations for the evening. The hours that followed were a blur of bathing and dressing, of hair arranged and jewels selected, of final adjustments and last-minute courage. When Adiz finally emerged in her own gown, the kente creation she had worn to the first tea, now pressed and perfect, she found Helena waiting in the corridor, transformed by the garment they had made together. The Duchess of Ashworth had never looked less like a duchess, and never more like a queen. The kente blazed against her pale skin, the gold embroidery catching the torchlight, the flowing sleeves moving like wings as she turned. Her hair had been styled simply, swept back from her face, and she wore a single piece of jewelry, a golden cuff bracelet set with amber that Adiz had not seen before. "It was my mother's," Helena explained, seeing her gaze. "She brought it from the East, from travels she undertook before I was born. It never matched anything I owned until now." "You are magnificent." "We are magnificent." Helena took her hand, squeezing tightly. "Together." They descended the stairs side by side. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion, long tables arranged in a U-shape to accommodate the assembled guests. Candelabras blazed on every surface, tapestries glowed in the warm light, and the finest silver and crystal had been laid in precise formation. Nearly 40 people filled the room, local nobility whom Lord Edmund had cultivated, curious onlookers who had accepted invitations without knowing quite what they were attending, and at the head table, Lord Edmund himself with his mother, their expression suggesting they believed the evening already won. The herald's voice cut through the murmur of conversation. Lady Helena Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, and her honored guest, Mistress Adiz Beaumont. The room fell silent. Helena entered first, her chin high, her stride confident, the gown flowing behind her like fire-made fabric. Adiz followed, equally proud, their hands linked in a gesture that proclaimed alliance more loudly than any words. The silence stretched. extended, became something with weight and texture. Lord Edmund rose from his seat, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and settling finally on contempt. What is the meaning of this spectacle? The meaning, cousin, Helena replied, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall, is that I am welcoming my guests in a manner I deem appropriate. Is that not a hostess's prerogative? That garment. The Dowager Countess seemed unable to form complete sentences. It is indecent, it is foreign, it is beautiful, said a voice from the crowd. Everyone turned. A young woman had risen from her seat, Lady Elizabeth Thornton, daughter of a baron known for her intelligence and her unfortunate tendency to speak her mind. The gown is beautiful, Lady Elizabeth repeated, stepping forward to examine it more closely. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. I have never seen anything like it. Nor have I, agreed another voice. Lord Andrew Pemberton, an elderly earl whose opinions carried weight throughout the region. Bold, certainly. Unusual, undoubtedly. But magnificent nonetheless. He turned to Helena with genuine curiosity. Where did you acquire such a creation? I made it, Ades said, stepping forward to stand beside Helena. The design is a collaboration between the Duchess and myself, blending traditions from Europe and from the continent of my ancestors. Each element carries meaning. Each pattern tells a story. A seamstress. Lord Edmund's lip curled. You bring a seamstress to dine with nobility, dressed in foreign rags, and you expect us to... I expect you to remember whose house you are standing in. Helena's voice cracked like ice breaking. I expect you to recall that you are here as my guest, not my judge. And I expect you to show respect to a woman whose skill and artistry exceed anything your precious London dressmakers have ever produced. The confrontation hung suspended, the entire room holding its breath. Then Lord Pemberton began to applaud. It was slow at first, the steady clap of aged hands, but others joined, Lady Elizabeth, and then a merchant who had made his fortune in textiles and recognized quality when he saw it, and then a minor lord who had always resented Edmund's presumption, and then more and more until the hall filled with the sound of appreciation. Lord Edmund stood frozen, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. His mother had gone pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. They had expected to find Helena isolated, vulnerable, easily pressured into surrender. They had not expected this. Perhaps, Lord Pemberton said mildly, we might all be seated and enjoy the excellent meal our hostess has prepared. I find political maneuvering dulls my appetite, but a good roast revives it wonderfully. The tension broke. Guests began moving to their assigned seats, conversations resuming in animated whispers. Helena caught Adaise's eye, and in that glance passed everything that could not be spoken aloud. Gratitude, triumph, and something deeper, warmer, more precious than victory. They dined that night as equals among the nobility. Adaise seated at Helena's right hand, answering questions about her techniques, her inspirations, her heritage. Some guests remained cold, uncomfortable, unwilling to abandon their prejudices even in the face of evident excellence. But others proved curious, even admiring, and by the end of the evening, Adaise had received 3 commissions for gowns and 2 invitations to visit estates throughout the region. Lord Edmund and his mother departed the next morning, their campaign in ruins. The petitions they had planned to file were never submitted. The allies they had hoped to cultivate had seen something that night that made them reconsider their allegiances. The woman they had intended to destroy had revealed herself as something entirely unexpected, not a vulnerable widow to be exploited, but a force to be reckoned with, surrounded by loyalty they could not comprehend. Winter softened into spring. The snow retreated from the fields, revealing green beneath the white, and the gardens of Castle Ashworth erupted into bloom. Roses climbed the ancient walls, their fragrance drifting through open windows, and the world seemed to exhale after months of holding its breath. Adaise had not returned to her cottage. There had been no formal invitation, no declared arrangement, simply a gradual accumulation of her possessions in the chamber adjoining Helena's, a natural migration that neither of them questioned. Her shop remained open, managed now by an apprentice she had trained, and she traveled there weekly to oversee commissions and teach the techniques that had made her famous. For famous she had become. The dinner at Castle Ashworth had been discussed in drawing rooms throughout the region, and the story grew with each telling. The exotic seamstress who had dressed the Duchess in African splendor, the confrontation with Lord Edmund, the applause that had signaled a shift in the social winds. Orders arrived from London, from Bristol, from Edinburgh. Nobility who would never have considered commissioning a gown from a dark-skinned woman now competed for the privilege. But it was not the fame that mattered. It was not even the prosperity, though that too had its comforts. What mattered was this. A May morning, sunlight streaming through the windows of the Rose Gallery, Helena seated at her writing desk with correspondence scattered before her, and a daze on the settee nearby, sketching designs for a commission that would be delivered to a countess in Bath. They had fallen into rhythm, these two women whom the world would never fully understand. Their days were filled with the ordinary business of living, estate management and creative work, social obligations and private pleasures. Their evenings were their own, spent in conversation or comfortable silence, reading aloud or simply sitting together as the fire burned low and the stars emerged beyond the windows. If there were those who whispered about the nature of their companionship, neither woman acknowledged it. They had learned in those first difficult weeks that the opinions of others held only the power one chose to grant them, and they had chosen together to grant them none. "There is a letter from Lady Elizabeth," Helena announced, looking up from her desk. "She wishes to visit next month and to bring her younger sister who has apparently developed an interest in unusual fashion." Another convert to the cause of textile rebellion? So it would seem. Helena smiled, that warm, unguarded smile that still had the power to make a daisy's heart stumble. "She also mentions that Lord Edmund has taken ill. Nothing serious, but enough to keep him confined to his estate for the foreseeable future." What a terrible shame. Truly devastating. Helena's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I shall have to send flowers." Adaz laughed, the sound filling the gallery like music. "You are wicked." "I learned from the best." Helena rose from her desk and crossed to the settee, settling beside Adaz with the ease of long familiarity. She looked at the sketch in progress, a gown of deep green velvet with gold accents, structured yet flowing. "That is beautiful." "It is coming along." "You say that about everything you create, and everything you create turns out to be extraordinary." Helena leaned her head against Adiz's shoulder, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Have I told you today that I am grateful?" "For what?" "For that afternoon in this very room, when you refused to break. For every moment since. For being brave enough to stay when wisdom would have sent you running." A daisy set aside her sketchbook and turned to face her. The sunlight caught the amber of Helena's eyes, turning them to honey, to gold, to warmth incarnate. "I stayed because running would have meant leaving something precious behind," she said softly. "I stayed because, for the first time in my life, I had found a place where I was seen. Not as a curiosity, not as a craftsperson to be used and forgotten, but as myself. All of myself. How could I have run from that? And now? Now I stay because this is home. You are home. Whatever the world may say, whatever challenges may come, I know where I belong. Here, with you. In this gallery where we first spoke truth to each other, surrounded by roses and sunlight and the promise of every day that follows." Helena reached up, cupping Adiz's face in her hands. "I love you," she whispered. "I do not know if those words are adequate. They seem too small for what I feel. But I love you, and I want you to know it. I want you to hear it spoken aloud, in this room where we began, so that it becomes as real and solid as the stones of this castle." Adiz felt tears prick her eyes, not of sorrow, but of something larger, something that had no name except perhaps joy. "I love you too," she answered. "I think I have loved you since you sent everyone away and asked to hear my truth. I think I will love you until the last thread is stitched and the final pattern is complete." They sat together in the sunlight, two women who had found in each other what the world had denied them: acceptance understanding, love without condition or apology. Outside, the gardens bloomed. Inside, something even more precious had taken root and flourished. The Duchess, who had invited a seamstress to tea to mock her, had instead found the great love of her life. And the seamstress who had arrived prepared to endure humiliation had instead discovered that grace comes not from circumstance, but from the courage to remain wholly oneself, even in the face of those who would diminish her. The first anniversary of the fateful dinner was marked by another gathering at Castle Ashworth, but this one was different. There were no enemies to confront, no positions to defend. There were only friends, gathered to celebrate something the invitations had deliberately left vague: a year of unexpected blessings. Lady Elizabeth came, of course, now a regular fixture in their lives, bringing her sister and her endless enthusiasm. Lord Pemberton attended, old and dignified, offering his arm to Adaze as they processed into the great hall. Even some of those who had initially stood with Lord Edmund appeared, their alliances quietly shifted, their prejudices quietly reconsidered. And there was one guest who had traveled farther than all the others. Her name was Amara, and she had arrived from Venice a week prior. A distant cousin of Adaze's mother, discovered through letters and inquiries that Helena had helped to send. She was 70 years old, with silver hair and skin the same rich brown as Adaze's, and she carried with her stories. Stories of their shared family, of traditions preserved against all odds, of a lineage that stretched back across oceans and centuries to a homeland neither of them had seen, but both carried in their blood. "Your mother would be proud," Amara said, taking Adaze's hands in her own. "She dreamed of something like this for you. Not wealth, not status, but belonging. A place where you could be fully yourself and fully loved." "I have found that place," Adaze replied, "and the person who made it possible." Across the hall, Helena caught her eye and smiled. That private smile that was theirs alone, that spoke of shared secrets and shared futures and all the days yet to unfold. The evening passed in warmth and laughter, in toasts and stories, in the simple pleasure of community created rather than inherited. And when the guests had finally departed and the candles had burned low, Adaze and Helena stood together in the rose gallery, looking out at the garden silvered by moonlight. "1 year," Helena murmured. "It seems both longer and shorter, as if we have known each other always, and also as if we are just beginning." "Perhaps both are true," Adaze suggested. "Perhaps love exists outside of time, and we simply stepped into something that was always waiting for us." Helena turned from the window and took both of Adaze's hands in her own. "I have something for you," she said. "A gift for this anniversary." "Helena, you have given me so much." "Hush, this is different." The Duchess reached into the pocket of her gown and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, she produced a ring. Gold, set with an amber stone that matched the bracelet she still wore, the amber surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the candlelight like stars. "This was made for you," Helena said softly. "I commissioned it from the finest goldsmith in London. The amber is from the same source as my mother's bracelet. Stones from the East carried across continents, finding their way to us across generations. And the gold..." She turned the ring so Adaze could see the inner band, where words had been engraved in careful script. Dignity forged in fire. "I want you to wear it," Helena continued, her voice trembling slightly, "not as a symbol of obligation, but as a promise. A promise that what we have built together will endure. That I am yours, and you are mine, and nothing in this world or any other can break what we have chosen." Adaze's vision blurred with tears. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger, where it fit perfectly, as if it had always been meant to rest there. "I promise," she whispered. "I promise to stand beside you to face whatever comes, to love you without reservation or retreat. I promise that what we have built will not crumble, will not fade, will not yield to time or trial. I promise you everything I am and everything I will become." They stood together in the moonlight, hands clasped, hearts full, two women who had defied every expectation and emerged not merely surviving but triumphant. The world beyond these walls would continue to judge them, to question them, to struggle with the unprecedented nature of their bond. But within these walls, within this room, within the space they had created together, there was only love. And love, they had learned, was the greatest grace of all. If you watched this far, it's because you felt something in this story, something that resonated, something that mattered. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and know who really loves the stories on this channel." And if this tale of courage, love, and the triumph of dignity touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that grace is not given. It is claimed. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of quiet strength, of love that defies expectation, and of women who refuse to be diminished by a world that underestimates them. Until we meet again in another story, in another time, remember, your dignity is your own. No one can take what you do not surrender.